When Dominic Caruso stepped into his Hamptons mansion a day earlier than anyone expected, the silence felt wrong dangerous. And when the new maid, Nina Hawthorne, pulled him into the shadows and whispered, "Don't speak," he realized he wasn't supposed to be alive. Upstairs, his wife and his most trusted lieutenant were already celebrating his death. That was the moment Dom understood someone inside his own house had scheduled his execution. Dominic Caruso arrived at his Hamptons mansion on a night when the Atlantic winds were beating violently against the shore, shaking the tall glass windows like a warning he didn't yet understand. The Gulfstream jet had touched down an hour earlier than anyone in New York expected, and Dominic had ordered the pilot not to alert his security team or his staff. He wanted space. He wanted a moment to breathe after a negotiation in Boston that had crashed and burned in record time. The failure wasn't what bothered him. It was the growing weight of exhaustion that had been settling in his bones for months, the kind of fatigue men in his world rarely survived. He pulled up the long, private driveway lined with sculpted hedges and stone lanterns imported from some wealthy Japanese estate sale. Most nights, the property looked like the polished kingdom of a man who controlled half of New York's underworld. Tonight it felt hollow, like the lights had gone out inside a living thing. His mansion, 9 bedrooms, an indoor pool, a wine cellar worth more than some people's entire lives, stood against the storm with a kind of coldness that didn't match its usual grandeur. He noticed immediately that the exterior sconces were off. The foyer chandelier wasn't glowing. Not a single window carried a trace of warm light. For a home that employed 24-hour staff, including security rotating in shifts, it was a glaring anomaly. Dominic's instinct sharpened. In his world, strange wasn't random, strange was deliberate. He keyed into the back entrance instead of the main doors, stepping directly into the mood room. The one place the security team usually left a pair of boots or jackets thrown around. Tonight, not even a shoelace was out of place. The house felt staged, carefully arranged, recently wiped down, and unsettlingly still. The faint citrus scent of the cleaning spray lingered in the air, fighting unsuccessfully against the deeper smell of old mahogany and the ocean's damp breath seeping through the walls. Dominic shrugged off his coat, hanging it on the brass hook near the door. He adjusted the collar of his tailored charcoal suit, still creased from the flight. His movements were deliberate, controlled. But beneath the control was an unease he couldn't name yet. The quiet didn't calm him. It pressed against him thick like humidity before a storm. And then there was another detail, a small one, but in Dominic's world, small details were the alarms of survival. The security panel near the kitchen had been reset. No green lights, no coded chimes. Someone had powered it down manually. Dominic stepped deeper into the mansion, each sound of the floorboards beneath his leather shoes amplified in the vast interior. He passed the open archway that led to the kitchen, where the stainless steel appliances gleamed faintly from the moonlight, pushing through the windows. The surfaces were spotless, but the coffee pot was missing. Mrs. Gable, the cook, never left without preparing it for morning. The counters were bare. Too bare. Dominic rested his hand near the inside of his jacket, fingers brushing the holster. Something was off. Every sense he relied on, every instinct honed from decades in a violent empire, was alert. The living room was next. Large, minimalist, expensive. The kind of room interior designers create for magazine spreads rather than actual human comfort. The glass sculpture Vanessa insisted on keeping stood on its pedestal, catching the limited light and refracting it across the room like a fractured star. He paused. A single drop of water slid off the end of his sleeve, landing on the marble floor. He hadn't realized he was still wet from the rain. He shook his arms and continued forward. But before he could make it to the staircase, something shifted in the hallway just barely enough for his attention to snap in that direction. A shadow person, his hand closed over his gun, and he drew it in one swift motion, ready to fire. But then she stepped into view. Nina, the new maid. The one who barely spoke above a murmur, who moved through the mansion like a ghost trying not to disturb the living. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with soft features that rarely showed expression. Tonight, however, her face was drained of all color, her chest rising and falling in fast, panicked breaths. She wasn't holding a vacuum or a dusting cloth. She was gripping the wall as if she needed it to remain upright. Dominic lowered the gun a fraction but kept it in his hand. "Nina," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying the edge of authority he didn't have to force. "Why are the lights off? Where is the staff?" She didn't answer. Instead, she crossed the hallway in 3 quick steps, quicker than he had ever seen her move, and reached for the front of his suit jacket. Her fingers were ice cold, trembling hard enough that he could feel it through the fabric. Dominic's eyes narrowed. He opened his mouth to speak again, to press for answers, but Nina moved first. She tugged sharply on his lapel, pulling him toward the narrow storage alcove beneath the staircase. Her grip was surprisingly strong, desperate even. She pressed her back into the wall, eyes darting upward toward the second floor, then at him, then upward again. Something was happening above them. Something she didn't have the words or time to explain. Dominic read people better than most men read books. Whatever she saw upstairs, whatever was happening in the rooms he couldn't yet see, it terrified her enough to break all the rules of her position, her role, and her fear of him. Only one thing could shake someone like that: danger close enough to taste. And suddenly he knew with cold certainty that his unexpected arrival had interrupted something he was never supposed to witness. His heart didn't race. Men like him didn't panic, but his mind sharpened into a blade. The storm outside wasn't the real threat. It was something inside his own home, something deliberate, something planned. And somehow a maid he barely knew was the only person standing between him and whatever waited upstairs. Dominic didn't need more than a second to understand that Nina wasn't acting out of confusion or nerves. Her eyes held a frantic urgency usually found in people who had already counted their remaining heartbeats. She raised one trembling hand and pointed upward toward the second floor, toward the lavish master suite where he and Vanessa slept, fought, made up, and fought again. Something was happening above them. Something that had driven this quiet, nearly invisible maid into a state of raw panic. He leaned slightly out of the alcove, listening. At first, he heard nothing besides the steady thrum of the rain and the muffled boom of waves crashing against the cliffs. But as he adjusted to the house around him, a faint murmur drifted down the staircase. Voices. Not the usual chatter of staff or the soft conversation of late-night guests. These voices were controlled, hushed not in a casual way, but with intent, like people trying to avoid detection. Dominic tilted his head, narrowing his focus. He recognized one of them almost immediately, Vanessa, his wife. Her tone wasn't stressed or emotional as it usually became during their marital debates. Instead, it carried an unfamiliar clarity, calm, deliberate, almost cold, and there was another voice, a male voice. One he knew better than he knew his own reflection. Mark Russo, his underboss, his right hand. The man who had stood beside him in every blood-soaked chapter of the Caruso empire. Dom's jaw tightened. The temperature in his chest dropped a few degrees. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Nina tugged his sleeve again, silently begging him to retreat farther into the shadowed alcove. He didn't move at first. He was too busy listening to the fragments drifting down the stairs. Once the jet goes down, the feds will assume it was an accident. Drowned somewhere between Boston and Long Island. We claim the estate quietly, no loose ends. Vanessa's voice came next, softer but tinged with impatience. The will triggers in 72 hours. I want everything transferred immediately. No delays. Dominic felt something familiar settling into his chest, not fear, not shock, but the kind of cold clarity that took over just before a man committed to violence. Every instinct he'd honed across decades screamed that this wasn't a misunderstanding. They weren't discussing business. They were discussing him. His death, his disappearance, his erasure. Mark Russo had been with him since their early 20s. Dom had paid for Mark's father's funeral. Mark had sworn loyalty on blood and bone. And his wife Vanessa, whose taste for luxury was exceeded only by her taste for attention, was calmly participating in the planning of his demise. Dominic's grip on his pistol tightened so hard the tendons in his hand strained. For a brief second he imagined walking up the stairs, pushing open the door, and ending both their lives with 2 clean shots to the head. The mansion was large, the rainstorm outside was loud, no one would hear a thing. But Nina suddenly pressed both hands to his chest, pushing him back just as a heavy boot step thudded against the second floor landing. More than one set of boots, actually. Several, men shifting calmly, confidently, as though they believed the house was theirs now. Nina reached in the pocket of her apron and pulled out something small and rectangular. A smartphone, but not the cheap type staff carried. This one was slim, expensive, clean. She tapped the screen twice and flipped it around for Dominic to see. It was security footage, but not from his system. These angles were too raw, too improvised, taken from hidden cameras he had never authorized. One showed the backyard lawn where men in tactical black were spreading out behind the hedges, carrying rifles fitted with suppressors. Another showed the front door already breached, 2 mercenaries stepping inside with the confidence of professionals who expected zero opposition. A third angle showed the driveway, where 3 black SUVs were parked with engines still running, no headlights, no license plates. Mark Russo's crew. But Mark never deployed men like this unless he intended somebody to disappear permanently. Dominic's jaw flexed as the truth settled in his gut. Mark had planned every detail with precision, using Dom's own home as a trap. And Vanessa, she had allowed it, even welcomed it. If Dominic had arrived on schedule, If his jet had taken off from Boston at the intended time, he would already be lying at the bottom of the Atlantic in a titanium coffin of twisted metal. He felt a slow burn rise from his ribcage, anger so hot it was almost clean, yet even in that heat he understood tact. Fury didn't save lives, calculation did. Nina squeezed his arm, then pointed down the hallway toward the service wing. Her eyes told him the truth before she even moved her lips. They were waiting for you upstairs. If you go up, you die. Follow me if you want a chance to fight back. Dominic studied her for a heartbeat. The maid he had barely noticed for months suddenly carried the weight of someone who understood the situation far better than he did. She wasn't simply scared, she had already accepted that the wrong move tonight would end both their lives. Without speaking, he nodded. Nina slipped out of the alcove and darted toward the side hallway, moving with surprising precision. Dominic followed, sticking to the edges of the floorboards where the wood was strongest. He kept his gun raised, checking over his shoulder every few steps. When they reached the far end of the corridor, Nina knelt beside a linen cupboard, slid aside the neatly folded towels, and pressed her fingertips into a small, nearly invisible seam in the paneling. A faint click echoed behind the wall, a hidden door, a passage, something even Dominic hadn't known existed in his own home. She pulled it open just wide enough for them to slip through. Dominic stared at her, trying to read the layers beneath that timid exterior. "How did you find this?" he whispered. Nina swallowed hard. "The records of the property the original owner built escape paths during Prohibition. I saw the blueprints." Her voice wavered, but her eyes stayed steady, steadier than he expected. She stepped into the narrow passageway first, turning her small penlight toward the ladder descending into the dark earth below. Dominic looked back once, toward the second floor where his wife and his most trusted ally were preparing to profit from his burial. Then he followed Nina into the hidden depths of the mansion, realizing with brutal clarity that the only person he could trust in his entire empire was the maid he never bothered to learn anything about. The passageway door clicked softly behind Dominic as he pressed his ear against the hidden panel, listening through the narrow sliver between wood and drywall. The voices upstairs sharpened now that he was positioned directly beneath them, traveling down through the beams and vents like a poison dripping into his home's foundation. Vanessa spoke first, her tone clipped, impatient, the same sound she used whenever she complained about dinner being served 10 minutes late. Yet tonight it carried an edge he had never heard from her, an authority she didn't possess on her own. If the jet had followed the schedule, Dominic would already be gone, she muttered, the faint clink of ice against glass punctuating her words. "I don't want complications. The last thing we need is an inquiry dragging this out." Mark Russo laughed, a low, relaxed sound that sent a sharp heat across Dominic's shoulders. Mark wasn't a natural laugher. When he did it, it was for show, a signal that he thought he controlled the room. "Relax, Vanessa. Everything's in motion. The mechanic I hired placed the valve exactly where the feds will think it failed on its own. Hydraulic leak, catastrophic pressure drop, jet sinks into the Atlantic. Clean story." Vanessa scoffed. "Nothing is clean with him." That sentence held more truth than she intended. Dominic's life had been built on 1,000 compromises, 1,000 bodies, 1,000 nights spent seeing the mistakes of men too scared to do the job themselves. Yet hearing his wife talk about him, like a chore she couldn't wait to be rid of, it hit him in a place he didn't show to anyone. Above him, Mark shifted, the floorboards creaking faintly. "Look, you'll get what you want. Once Dom is declared missing, you get full control of the estate. His accounts roll over to you, his properties, every last asset. Meanwhile, I take the family." "You take the family," Vanessa repeated, as if tasting the words. "And what do I get?" "The world," Mark replied. "Everything he denied you because he was too focused on business. You won't just be his widow, you'll be the first lady of the new Caruso empire." Dominic's jaw tensed so hard his molars etched. The arrogance in Mark's voice was something he had ignored too many times. He had given Mark authority, trust, power. He had defended him, raised him, mentored him. And Mark had spent that loyalty the way a gambler spends chips he never earned. Dominic steadied his breathing, though his pulse hammered in his throat. Vanessa spoke again, this time lower, her voice brushing the edge of suspicion. "And the staff?" Mark's answer came with unsettling ease. "Already taken care of. The night shift was paid to take the evening off. And the daytime crew thinks Dominic is still in Boston. They'll return tomorrow morning to a normal routine." Vanessa paused, then asked the question Dominic dreaded but expected. "What about the girl, the new maid, Nina?" Dominic felt Nina stiffen in the darkness beside him. He didn't look at her, but he sensed the spike of panic in her breath. Mark's tone hardened. "She saw me coming through the back gate earlier. That makes her a loose end." Vanessa let out a frustrated sigh. Handle it quietly, I don't want blood on my rugs. Mark chuckled again. Please, I'm not an amateur. I'll tell her Dominic needs an errand run, escort her out, take her to the Marsh Road. You won't see her again. Nina's hand rose to her mouth, but Dominic was faster. He caught her wrist gently, grounding her. She trembled under his grip, not from weakness but from understanding. She had heard her death sentence spoken as casually as ordering takeout. Dominic leaned closer to the wall, listening as the conversation shifted. Vanessa's heels clicked softly across the hardwood as she began pacing. And you're sure the other families won't suspect? Please, Mark scoffed. I'll spin the story however we need. Dominic dies in an accident. We pin the destabilization on the Marsali family. They look guilty. Our men avenge him. And while everyone is busy shooting each other, we consolidate the territory. It's perfect. Vanessa stopped moving. Perfect is risky. Perfect means one mistake ruins everything. And the biggest mistake right now is that Dominic isn't answering his phone. He's on a jet, Mark said dismissively. No signal until he hits the coast. Stop worrying. Vanessa didn't answer immediately. Her hesitation stuck out like broken glass. He always checks in, she finally said. Every trip city, he always checks in. Dominic felt something ignite in his chest, something colder than anger, sharper than betrayal. She knew him well enough to sense something off. Yet she still plotted his death. Mark walked across the room, his footsteps heavy with confidence. Vanessa, listen to me. Dominic Caruso is the most paranoid, overcautious man on the East Coast. He'd never see this coming. He trusts me. He still thinks I'm the kid he pulled out of the gutter. And that blind trust. That's exactly why he won't survive the night. Dominic's breath slowed to a dangerous calm. There it was, the truth Mark had hidden behind years of loyalty and false humility. The truth Dominic had refused to see. Mark hadn't just betrayed him. Mark had waited for this, dreamed of it, planned for it. Vanessa exhaled in relief, as if reassured by Mark's confidence. Fine, she said. But once the estate transfers, we leave New York. Miami or somewhere sunny, somewhere with a view, anywhere you want, Mark promised. But first, we bury a king. Dominic shut his eyes for just a moment, not in denial but in acceptance. He had built an empire on intelligence, brutality, and loyalty. Loyalty, however, was a currency that ran out fast in a world of ambition. And now in his own home, two people who owed their lives to him were casually planning to erase him from history. Dominic opened his eyes again and turned to Nina. Her fear had settled into something like determination, her gaze steady in the dark. She wasn't just trying to protect him. She refused to let them kill her either. He nodded once, a silent pact between a king outnumbered and a girl written off as expendable. Upstairs, Vanessa raised her glass. To Dominic Caruso, she said. Mark clinked his drink against hers. May his memory be profitable. Dominic stepped back from the wall, every muscle in his body wired with purpose. They thought they could write the end of his story. They were wrong. The next chapter wouldn't be written by traitors. It would be written by him. The air inside the hidden passage was stale, dense, and thick with years of dust untouched by human breath. Dominic descended the narrow ladder first, boots scraping against metal rungs that groaned under his weight. Nina followed closely, her smaller frame moving with a practiced carefulness that hinted she had rehearsed this escape long before tonight. When they reached the bottom, Dominic clicked on her small penlight, shielding it with his palm. A dim glow stretched across the cramped brick tunnel, revealing a narrow corridor that seemed to run beneath the entire estate. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like rotting curtains. The dirt floor felt damp, uneven beneath their steps. It was a place designed to hide people who had no business being found. Dominic took a breath, scanning their surroundings like a man preparing for war. How far does this run? He asked, keeping his voice low. Past the wine cellar, Nina whispered back. Then it leads toward the old storm drains. The path ends near the tree line outside the property. Dominic nodded. That exit would put them at least half a mile from the main road. Far enough to avoid immediate detection. But only if they moved now. He motioned for her to stay close and began walking. The penlight shook slightly in Nina's grip, scattering shadows across the most darkened walls. She kept glancing over her shoulder, not because she heard anything, but because humans could sense danger without sound. And tonight, danger was everywhere. Above them, the faint tremor of heavy footsteps vibrated through the beams and into the ground. Dominic felt them like a pulse, measured, steady, lethal. Mark's men were spreading through the mansion with the methodical sweep of professionals. They weren't searching, they were hunting. Dominic stopped walking for a moment, lifting a hand to signal Nina to freeze. More footsteps. Louder ones, heading toward the hallway above the hidden passage. The mercenaries were checking rooms one by one, clearing each space with cold efficiency. If they found the panel in the linen closet, this tunnel would become a trap with no exit. Dominic's mind sharpened. He calculated the layout of his estate. The likely routes the mercenaries would take, the weapons they carried, the time it would take for them to discover the hidden door. He didn't like the math. He grabbed Nina's elbow gently but firmly. "Move faster," he murmured. "We don't have long." They quickened their pace. The tunnel tightened around them. The ceiling dropped low enough for Dominic to duck. A chill seeped through the floor, suggesting they were nearing the older parts of the estate structures built when bootleggers used these coastal mansions to store liquor during Prohibition. Nina had been right. This place wasn't on modern blueprints. Not even Dominic, who oversaw every construction detail of his property, had known about it. Eventually the passage opened into a small chamber reinforced by thick concrete walls. Rusted machinery sat abandoned in one corner, equipment from decades earlier. The sound of rain filtered down faintly through unseen cracks, proving they were getting closer to the outer edge of the estate. Dominic checked the ceiling again. Faint vibrations continued. The hunters had not given up, and then came something worse. A distorted, metallic scraping echoed through the tunnel behind them. Nina stiffened instantly. What was that? Dominic raised a hand, signaling her to stay still. Then he heard it again, low radio chatter, boots shifting. And finally someone pulling open a vent panel further up the tunnel. Mark's mercenaries had found one of the auxiliary access points. Dominic cursed under his breath. "Go," he whispered, pushing Nina gently forward. "Now." They entered the final stretch of the passage, a narrower section where the walls pressed inward like the rib cage of a buried monster. Nina sprinted, her breath quick and sharp. Dominic stayed a few steps behind her, keeping himself positioned between her and the threat approaching from the rear. The tunnel veered left, then right, then sloped downward into a drainage culvert lined with jagged stone that glistened from years of seepage. Ahead, faint moonlight poured through a grate partially covered by overgrown vines. The exit. But reaching it wouldn't be enough. He had to get Nina through it alive. Dominic reached the grate first and wedged his fingers between the rusted bars. He pulled hard, muscles straining, and the metal gave with a reluctant groan. Nina ducked through immediately, crawling under the hanging vines and emerging into the soaking, wind-swept grass outside. Dominic followed, ripping the remaining vines aside. The storm had worsened. Sheets of rain crashed down with violent force, blurring the forest beyond. Behind them, deep in the tunnel, the mercenaries' footsteps grew louder. The chase was seconds away. Dominic grabbed Nina's hand. "Run." They sprinted into the woods. Branches whipped against Dominic's face as he pushed through the dense underbrush. The rain masked their tracks, but visibility was low and the forest floor was uneven. Twice Nina stumbled, and twice Dominic steadied her with a firm grip at her waist or wrist. The girl had courage, but courage didn't erase exhaustion. They need to reach the service road. Nina's car was parked there, she had said, but the forest felt endless, and the storm drowned out everything except the pounding of their steps and their heavy breaths. Behind them, the first shouts broke through the night. Mark's men had reached the tunnel exit. Flashlights flickered among the trees like predators' eyes catching moonlight. They were spreading out, Nina gasped. Dominic turned briefly. The mercenaries moved fast, splitting into squads with military precision. They checked the ground with tactical beams, communicating through radios that crackled with clip commands. Dominic's world had always been dangerous, but this being hunted through his own land was a violation so profound it fueled him with a new kind of rage. They would not catch him. They would not catch Nina. Dominic spotted a dip in the terrain, to their right a slope leading to a dried creek bed. It wasn't the direct path to the road, but it offered cover. "Down here," he ordered, pulling her with him. They skidded down the muddy incline, nearly losing footing, and landed hard in the shallow trench below. Water pooled around their ankles as the rain hammered the earth. Nina winced. Dominic noticed. "You hurt." "Just my knee," she breathed. "Keep moving. I can run." He respected that. Not many people could maintain composure while being chased by trained killers. They followed the curve of the dried creek, using its natural walls as a shield. The forest above echoed with pursuit, footsteps, barking orders, splitting search teams. Then, worst of all, the mechanical wear of a drone. A spotlight swept across the treetops. Dominic cursed again. Mark's men had thermal imaging. They weren't just determined, they were equipped. He pulled Nina against the wall of the trench, covering her with his body as the drone's beam sliced across the forest where they had been moments ago. "They're retracking heat signatures," Dominic muttered. "We stay under cover or we re-dead." Nina nodded, gripping his jacket with cold, shaking hands. The seconds passed with brutal slowness as the drone hovered, scanning. Every breath felt like it might betray them. Finally, the beam shifted away. The drone moved on. Dominic exhaled once. "Steady." "We head for your car," he said. "We stick to the creek bed until it bends toward the road. Stay close. Don't fall behind." Nina steadied herself and nodded. Despite the danger, her eyes held a fierce resolve. Dominic saw it clearly now. She hadn't chosen to help him out of fear alone. She was fighting for her own life, her own justice. She had become part of this war the moment she tried to save him. Together, they began running again through the dark ravine, chased by men who believed they had already died tonight. The storm pounded harder as Dominic and Nina followed the bend of the dry creek bed, the trench serving as their only shield from the drones sweeping above. Water rushed around their shoes now as the once dry gully struggled to swallow the downpour. The forest beyond the banks roared with the chaotic chorus of pursuit boots crashing over fallen branches, radios crackling with clipped orders, trained killers converging with the efficiency of wolves closing ranks on prey. Dominic wasn't prey, not to never. But even he knew the reality. Mark Russo hadn't just sent thugs, he had hired specialists. Men who understood terrain, tracking, and termination. Men who wouldn't retreat without a body. Nina kept pace beside him, soaked to the bone, strands of wet hair plastered against her cheeks. Her breaths came fast but controlled. She stumbled once when her foot caught a submerged rock, and Dominic caught her elbow before she hit the ground. She steadied herself with a quick nod. "I'm good," she said, though her voice shook. "The car isn't far." "How far?" "Few minutes. Maybe less if we keep following the creek until it splits." That was encouraging until Dominic heard the sound of tires in the distance. Engines revving, vehicles repositioning. Mark's men weren't restricting their search to the estate anymore. They were spreading onto the surrounding service roads. Dominic cursed under his breath. The mercenaries were tightening their formation with cold precision. They weren't guessing, they were calculating. Dominic and Nina had one chance, and one chance only reached the Honda before the net closed around them. They pushed forward. The creek bed narrowed, funneling them between stone walls slick with moss. Rainwater cascaded down in small sheets, turning the path into a shallow river. Each step became heavier, more urgent. Above them, flashlights flickered through the trees like fireflies with intent to kill. Voices shouted. Dominic could distinguish at least 3 accents from the echoing calls: Eastern European, Southern American. One voice clipped with the cadence of private military training. Mark hadn't just hired muscle. He'd hired a coalition of professionals who owed him favors or money. Men with zero conscience and a good understanding of how to clean up after themselves. Dominic and Nina reached the point where the creek forked into 2 channels, each disappearing into deeper darkness. Nina pointed left without hesitation. "That way, the road's just beyond that ridge. Move," Dominic said. They climbed up the slippery slope, using exposed roots as handholds. Mud slid under their boots, trying to pull them backward. Thunder cracked above them, shaking the ground as if the sky itself was warning them to hurry. When they reached the top of the ridge, Dominic froze. Below, parked crookedly along the side of the narrow service road, was Nina's old silver Honda Civic, a modest, aging compact car that looked wildly out of place in the middle of a high-stakes manhunt. But it represented freedom, survival, a chance to get ahead of the men coming for them. The downside. 3 black SUVs were barreling down the road in their direction, headlights slicing through sheets of rain like knives. "We have to move," Dominic said, pulling Nina forward. They skidded down the ridge, slipping on wet leaves. Nina fumbled with her keys, hands trembling from cold and adrenaline. Dominic kept his pistol raised, scanning the tree line and road for ambush. The SUVs were close, too close. Engines roared, tires hissed on wet pavement, and he could see the silhouettes of riflemen inside each vehicle. Nina reached the Honda's driver door and yanked the handle. It opened, but not without a metallic groan that seemed far too loud in their desperate situation. She collapsed into the seat, shoving the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, protested. Dominic slid into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind him. "Start it," he growled. "I'm trying." Nina snapped, wiggling the key with frantic, practiced movements. The Honda cuffed again. The SUV sped closer. Dominic tightened his grip on his pistol. He could shoot, but it wouldn't matter. 3 SUVs versus 1 gun wasn't a fight. It was a death sentence. Then the Honda roared to life with a rattling shudder. Dominic almost smiled. "Drive." Nina threw the car into gear, floored the gas, and the little Civic lurched forward with all the determination its aging engine could muster. Behind them, headlights flared as the SUVs accelerated. The chase burst into full speed instantly. Bullets cracked through the storm, punching into the rear bumper with sharp metallic clangs. Dominic twisted in his seat and fired 2 shots out the back window. One of the SUVs jerked slightly as a bullet struck its hood, but the driver corrected quickly. These weren't amateurs. Nina swerved the Honda into the narrowest part of the service road, tires kicking up mud. Rain blasting the windshield so hard the wipers barely kept up. "They're regaining," Nina said, voice trembling between panic and determination. "Hold it steady," Dominic answered. "I'll make them back off." He fired again, shattering the rear windshield completely. Glass sprayed across the seats, mixing with rain as the storm filled the open space behind them. The SUVs closed in, their beams were blinding. Nina gritted her teeth and pushed the Honda to its limit, the car groaning in protest as it hit speeds it was never meant to reach on a road this narrow. Dominic reloaded quickly, eyes scanning the terrain ahead. Next turn, take it fast, he instructed. The main road splits there. We might lose them. Nina shot back, better than nothing. She reached the turn and yanked the wheel, sending the Honda fishtailing before it finally caught traction. One SUV failed to adjust in time, skidding sideways and slamming into a tree with a loud, splintering crash. 2 more remained. Dominic exhaled sharply. 1 down, but not enough. The remaining SUVs accelerated, closing the gap again. Dominic fired until the slide clicked empty. He tossed the gun aside and braced his hands on the dashboard. They were not stopping, Nina said. They'll run us off the road. Not if we make their job harder. Dominic pointed ahead. See that old factory? Through the rain, the outline of a massive abandoned industrial building came into view. Broken windows, rust-covered walls. A forgotten monument of Long Island's old textile boom. Nina's eyes widened. You want to hide in there? No, Dominic said. I want to make our stand. Nina gulped, knuckles white on the steering wheel, but she didn't argue. She turned the wheel sharply and aimed the Honda straight toward the yawning darkness of the factory's loading bay. Behind them, the SUVs roared like predators closing in on a trapped animal. Dominic glanced at Nina, seeing fear in her expression, fear layered with grit she probably didn't know she had until tonight. Stay with me, he said. We're not dying here. Nina nodded once. Then tell me what you need. Dominic looked at the factory as they approached, already calculating the battlefield ahead. I need time, he said. Time to turn this hunt around. The Honda shot into the factory's shadows and the real fight began. The Honda skidded across the cracked concrete floor of the abandoned textile factory, its tires screeching as Nina fought to keep control. The cavernous space swallowed them whole. Massive steel beams, rusted machinery, and conveyor belts frozen in time stood like skeletal remains of a forgotten era. Rain hammered the roof panels high above, each metallic rattle echoing through the dark interior like distant artillery fire. Dominic jumped out before the car even fully stopped, crouching low as he scanned the shadows for vantage points. Nina scrambled out behind him, clutching her bruised ribs from the impact of the wild chase. The air inside the factory was heavy with dust and the sore scent of mold. It was a place built for ghosts, and tonight it was about to become a battlefield. Up there, Dominic said, pointing to a steel catwalk 20 feet above them. High ground gives us a chance. Nina didn't hesitate. She followed him to the rusted staircase, moving fast despite her exhaustion. They climbed quickly, boots clanging against metal steps that shook under their weight. Beneath them, the loading bay doors shuddered, then burst inward as the first SUV smashed through with brutal force. Headlights flared, cutting through dust clouds. The vehicle skidded to a violent stop, and armed men spilled out, rifles raised. Dominic pulled Nina behind a heavy generator casing just as a barrage of gunfire erupted. Bullets ripped through the metal railings of the catwalk, sparks flying like angry stars. The beams rattled violently but held. Dominic checked his pistol empty. He tossed it aside and grabbed a length of rusted pipe lying near the generator. It wasn't much, but it was something. Stay low, he told Nina. If they get up here, we move. She nodded, breath shaky but eyes sharp. Below, the mercenaries advanced in formation, sweeping their rifles across the catwalk. Their boots thudded in a chilling rhythm, trained, practiced, professional. One of them shouted into a radio, and the second SUV pulled into the building. The hunters had doubled their forces. Dominic's mind worked fast. He scanned the catwalk, the walls, the machinery. At the far end of the steel walkway, he spotted something, a breaker box with a faded label, emergency suppression system. The factory's old dye vats were directly beneath the catwalk. If the system still functioned even partially, he could use it. Nina, he said, pointing, see that lever at the end? Pull it when I say. What does it do? Changes the odds. Before she could respond, a grenade clattered onto the factory floor below. Dominic grabbed Nina and pulled her flat as the explosion tore through old machinery, sending shards of rusted metal flying. The blast rocked the catwalk, nearly knocking them off their feet. Dust poured down in clouds. The mercenaries shouted and began spreading out underneath the walkway. Dominic pushed Nina toward the breaker box. Go now. She sprinted along the catwalk, keeping her body low, dodging through the shifting shadows. Dominic moved in the opposite direction, drawing attention away from her. The mercenaries spotted him immediately. Gunfire erupted again, bullets slicing through the railings. Dominic ducked behind a support beam and hurled the rusted pipe at one of the overhead lights. It shattered, plunging half the catwalk into darkness. Confusion erupted below. Several mercenaries adjusted their sights, trying to reacquire targets. Others split up, climbing the stairs on opposite sides of the factory. Dominic saw both groups and knew time was running out. He yelled across the catwalk, "Nina! Now!" She pulled the lever down with both hands. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a deep metallic groan echoed through the rafters. Old pipes shuddered, bulged, and burst. Instead of water, a cloud of ancient dye powder and rust-filled dust exploded outward, engulfing the catwalk and factory floor in a thick, choking fog. Visibility dropped to almost zero. Mercenaries cursed, coughing violently, disoriented. Their night vision goggles turned useless in the haze. Dominic sprang into motion. Using the fog as cover, he sprinted along the catwalk toward the nearest mercenary climbing the stairs. The man didn't see him until Dominic slammed into him, driving him backward. They tumbled down several steps, hitting the landing hard. The mercenary recovered quickly, swinging his rifle like a club. Dominic blocked the blow with his forearm, grabbed the rifle barrel, and drove his elbow into the man's throat. The mercenary collapsed, wheezing. Dominic ripped the weapon free. He didn't hesitate. He fired upward toward the catwalk, covering Nina as she tried to escape deeper into the factory. Bullets tore through the dust clouds, hitting metal beams and cracked cement. Dominic felt heat streak across his arm as one shot grazed him, but he kept moving. 2 more mercenaries reached the lower landing. Dominic fired a controlled burst. One went down, the other ducked behind a concrete pillar and returned fire. Dominic dove behind a fallen beam, bullets thudding into the concrete where his head had been seconds earlier. Above him, Nina crawled along the top of a broad support pipe that ran the length of the wall. The fog thickened around her, concealing her position. She used the chaos brilliantly. Moving silently across the suspended pipe and toward the back exit of the factory, a rusted steel door half welded shut. Dominic saw more movement below, another mercenary squad entering through a side door. They spread out, arcs of their flashlights slicing through the dust-choked air. Dominic checked the rifle, half a magazine left. Enough to buy time. He fired again, a tight 3-round burst that forced the squad to scatter. The ricochets echoed through the cavernous space like cracks in the earth. Nina reached the steel door and pushed hard. It didn't budge. She threw her weight into it again. The hinges groaned. Dominic saw what she was trying to do and realized she might become trapped if he didn't intervene. He fired one final suppressive burst, then sprinted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Gunfire exploded behind him. He felt a bullet snap past his shoulder, but didn't stop. He reached the catwalk just as Nina kicked the door again. This time it burst open, slamming outward into the rain-soaked night. She turned back toward Dominic, hand outstretched. "Come on!" He grabbed her hand and pulled her through the doorway just as another volley of gunfire shattered the paneling behind them. Outside, the storm was relentless. Rain pelted their faces with needle-sharp force. The forest stretched ahead, dark but open enough to give them a chance to disappear. Dominic dragged the steel door shut, jamming a bent pipe through the handle to buy them precious seconds. Nina was gasping, soaked, shaking but alive. Dominic looked back at the factory. Flashes of gunfire lit up the interior like lightning trapped inside the walls. The hunters were still coming. Dominic slung the rifle over his shoulder, placed a hand on Nina's back and urged her forward. "We were not done yet," he said. "But we were not dying in that building." Together they plunged into the storm, running toward the only kind of safety they had left: distance, darkness, and whatever allies Dominic could find before Mark Russo caught up again. The storm chased Dominic and Nina across the deserted industrial coastline, the 2 of them stumbling over jagged rocks and sinking mud as the roar of waves crashed nearby. They didn't speak. Survival didn't leave room for conversation. Every breath Dominic drew burned in his chest. But the only thing louder than the storm was the knowledge that Mark Russo had just tried to erase him from the world. Mark had succeeded in spreading death many times, but tonight he'd failed, and failure would make him desperate. Dominic needed allies. Not friends. He didn't have those anymore. Allies built from necessity, leverage, and shared enemies. Only one man fit that description. Don Salvatore Marcelli, a rival-ick, and the only person Mark would never anticipate Dominic turning to. The Marcelli dockyard wasn't far, but traveling there on foot through a storm with mercenaries behind them felt like threading a needle inside a hurricane. Nina kept close at his side, her breath sharp, her clothes soaked and clinging to her small frame. Yet she didn't complain, didn't hesitate, didn't collapse. Dominic respected that more than he expected. Few people in his world could handle this level of pressure without cracking. They reached a chain-link fence that bordered an abandoned rail yard. Dominic squeezed through a tear in the metal, then helped Nina crawl through behind him. The dirt turned to gravel, and the looming shadows of old cargo containers stretched across the ground like giant tombstones. "Where are we going?" Nina finally asked through the rain, her voice raw. Dominic paused just long enough to glance back at her, to the docks. To someone who hates Mark Russo even more than I do, a friend, she asked. Dominic gave a humorless laugh, not even close. They wove through the maze of metal containers until the skeleton of the old shipyard tower came into view. Rust streaked its beams like dried blood. Beyond it, through the sheets of storm rain, the active docks glowed with yellow floodlights. Men loyal to the Marcelli family patrolled the perimeter, rifles slung casually as if they expected nothing more than a smuggler trying to steal liquor. Dominic knew better. Marcelli's security always had sniper overwatch somewhere out of sight. Approaching without being blown apart required strategy. But Dominic Caruso wasn't just anyone. Even his enemies knew his shape in the dark. Stay close, he murmured. Nina nodded, her face pale but her eyes determined. He stepped forward, lifting both hands to show he carried no weapon in reach. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, dripping from his jaw. He looked nothing like the untouchable king of the Hamptons. He looked like a man risen from a grave with unfinished business. One of the guards spotted him first, Caruso. The guard's voice cracked through the storm. "You supposed to be?" Dominic lifted a hand sharply. "If you want answers," he shouted over the rain, "take me to Salvatore. Now." The guards exchanged looks, unsure whether to shoot him or obey him. Nina stepped slightly behind Dominic, instinctively seeking cover even while soaked and exhausted. Finally, one of the guards spoke into his radio. A tense pause followed. Then a single phrase came back through the speaker, "Bring him in." The gates creaked open, and Dominic walked through with the posture of someone who had every right to be there. Even if technically he didn't. Inside, the dockyard buzzed with controlled chaos, workers unloading crates, forklifts beeping as they maneuvered pallets. Men with Marcelli tattoos smoking under steel awnings to escape the rain. All eyes turned toward Dominic. Some widened in shock, others narrowed with suspicion. One man spat on the ground, muttering a curse. Another whispered, thought he was dead. Dominic didn't look at any of them. He walked straight toward Warehouse 4B, the heart of Marcelli territory. Two guards opened the door without a word. Inside, the warehouse was lit by dim overhead fluorescents that flickered like dying stars. And there, sitting at the center of the room on an ornate chair that didn't belong in a place smelling of diesel and sea salt, was Don Salvatore Marcelli. The old man's silver hair was slicked back, his sharp gaze tracking Dominic with the curiosity of someone watching a ghost perform tricks. "Well," Salvatore murmured, tapping his cane lightly against the concrete floor, "look who crawled out of the Atlantic." Dominic stepped into the pool of light cast by a single hanging bulb. Rain dripped from his clothes, pooling at his feet. Nina stood behind him, trying to make herself small even as her eyes darted around the room, memorizing exits. "I didn't drown," Dominic said flatly, "and I didn't come here by choice." Salvatore smirked. "Men like you rarely do anything by choice." "Sit." Dominic didn't sit. He remained standing, meeting the old Mafia boss's gaze without flinching. "Mark Russo tried to kill me." Salvatore arched an eyebrow. "This is supposed to surprise me." Dominic ignored him. "He planted devices on my jet. He hired mercenaries. He took my wife into his plan. They stole my estate, my men, my entire operation. Tonight." Salvatore leaned back, folding his hands neatly over the top of his cane. "A coup. A classic move, very old school, and you survived it." "Impressive." Dominic stepped closer. "I didn't come for admiration. I came because Mark won't stop until he controls New York. Including your ports." Salvatore's eyes darkened. "He wouldn't dare." "He already has," Dominic said. "He's framing your people for my murder. He wants the families fighting while he cleans up the remains." That hit its target. Salvatore's jaw tightened. The men flanking him shifted uneasily. Nina watched Dominic carefully, as if studying how he wielded truth like a blade. "If I'm dead," Dominic continued, "your organization becomes the scapegoat. The cops will raid you, the feds will feast on your operations. You will lose everything." Salvatore lifted his chin. "And you offer me what?" Dominic didn't blink. "A partnership, temporary. You help me take down Mark Russo, and I give you real territory north of the river." The warehouse went still. One of Salvatore's guards muttered under his breath. Another sucked in a sharp breath. Territory meant power. Power meant legacy. Salvatore's lips twitched. "That is a steep price." "Not compared to losing your empire," Dominic replied. Nina stepped forward slightly, voice steady despite the intimidation in the room. "Mark already moved his men. They were not loyal, they repaid. And they would sell you to the D the moment he tells them." Salvatore's gaze snapped toward her. "The maid speaks." Nina didn't look away. "The maid listens." Dominic hid his surprise. The girl had backbone, the kind that survived wars. The old boss's expression shifted from amusement to consideration to something resembling grudging respect. Finally, he stood with a grunt, using his cane for leverage. "Very well, Dominic Caruso," he said. "You want your kingdom back. I want my enemy's head. You can have Russo, but the north side belongs to me. Dominic didn't hesitate. Done. Salvatore extended his hand. Dominic grit with the force of a man sealing a pact with fate. The alliance was forged not out of trust, but out of necessity, a temporary bond wrapped in blood and vengeance. They were enemies yesterday. Tonight they were partners. Tomorrow they'd share a battlefield. Dominic released Salvatore's hand and turned slightly toward Nina. Her face was streaked with mud and rain, but her eyes were fierce. She wasn't just surviving, she was evolving. Salvatore noticed it too. Keep that one close, he said to Dominic. She's more dangerous than she looks. Dominic didn't argue. He already knew. As thunder rolled across the New York coastline, Dominic Caruso stood in the heart of enemy territory with the only ally capable of helping him reclaim his throne. And for the first time since the night began, he felt something other than fury. He felt the beginning of a war he could win. The warehouse felt colder after Dominic sealed the deal with Salvatore Marsili, as if the old steel beams themselves understood that a new war had just been born. The rain outside pounded against the walls like 1,000 fists, rattling loose metal panels and shaking the rafters. Dominic stepped back, studying Salvatore's guards as they lingered in tight formation around their boss. These men weren't hired killers like Mark's mercenaries, they were family-born soldiers made, not rented. Convincing them had been hard enough. Keeping their support would require something sharper, something undeniable. Next to Dominic, Nina stiffened as all eyes suddenly shifted to her. The weight of the moment pressed on her small frame, but her expression remained steady. She looked nothing like a maid now. She looked like someone who had stepped into a world she was never supposed to survive and refused to leave quietly. Salvatore leaned on his cane and studied her with clinical interest. This girl, he said. She speaks though she has something important to offer. Tell me, little hawk, why should I believe anything you say? Nina swallowed but did not retreat. She stepped forward into the glow of the hanging bulb, the rainwater still dripping from her hair, her uniform torn and streaked with dirt. Because Mark Russo talked too much, she said. He trusted the walls more than he should have. And I was in those rooms far more often than he realized. A ripple moved through the room. Guards exchanged glances. Salvatore's eyebrows lifted, skeptical but intrigued. Go on. Nina clasped her hands together, more to hide their shaking than anything else. She drew a slow breath and began. Mark has been moving money quietly. Offshore accounts, new shell companies in 3 states, and a set of encrypted transactions he ran through a federal contractor. Salvatore's gaze sharpened. Federal contractor, Nina nodded. Contact in the DIA, he bragged about it once. Said he didn't need to fight you directly if he could let the federal government do it for him. Mark had never said those exact words, but Nina delivered the lie with surgical precision, building it around truths Dominic recognized. Mark had been acting secretive. Mark did have a history of cutting deals behind people's backs. The story fit perfectly, too perfectly. Dominic understood instantly what she was doing. She wasn't just telling Salvatore what he wanted to hear, she was telling him what would motivate a man like him to go to war without hesitation. One of the guards stepped forward, anger sliding across his features like a shadow. Boss, if the D hits our docks they won't. Nina cut in, her voice gaining steel. Not if you stop Mark before he calls them. He thinks he can use the feds to clear out competition. He thinks once Dominic disappears, he can control the entire city, your side included. Salvatore turned slightly toward Dominic, his expression as cold as winter sea. And you? I believe her, Dominic replied, his tone firm and low. Nina shot him a quick glance, surprised, grateful, but still focused. Dominic had no proof to offer, but he didn't need proof. He understood how the game was played. Perception was proof, motive was evidence. And Nina had just built a foundation strong enough to carry the weight of a war. Salvatore walked toward her slowly, cane tapping rhythmically on the concrete. Every guard watched his movements with rigid attention, as though the wrong answer from Nina would end with a bullet to her head. He stopped barely 2 feet from her, his weathered face unreadable. If what you're retelling me is false, he murmured, I will know. And when I know, you will not have a pleasant end. Nina didn't flinch. If I were lying, she said, Dominic wouldn't have survived tonight. And neither would I. Salvatore studied her a long moment, then finally stepped back. Ambition makes men reckless, he said. Russo was always ambitious. But using federal dogs to clear my territory, he scoffed, disgusted. That I cannot tolerate. One of the guards spoke up. Should we move now, boss? Not yet, Salvatore replied. We strike when the wound is fresh. Tomorrow night the city believes Dominic is dead. The Caruso estate will be overflowing with politicians' families, the press, everyone pretending to mourn while waiting for their piece of the corpse. Dominic understood immediately. You want to walk through the front gate? Salvatore smirked. Why settle for a quiet kill when you can set the stage for a spectacle? Nina exhaled slowly, realizing the shape of the plan forming around them. Dominic stepped beside her, lowering his voice so only she heard him. You knew exactly what to say. She met his gaze, not shy or timid this time. I knew what he needed to hear. Dominic allowed himself a small, rare smile she wasn't guessing. She understood the psychology of power better than most men who had lived their whole lives chasing it. Salvatore turned back to his men. Prepare the cars, weapons clean, dress formal. Tomorrow we pay our respects to the widow. A low rumble of agreement echoed among the guards. But Salvatore wasn't finished. He approached Dominic again. Be clear on one thing, he said. This alliance ends the moment Russo is gone. After that we return to our world as it was. Dominic nodded. I'm not looking to keep partners longer than necessary. Salvatore gripped his cane harder than before. Good. I prefer enemies, I understand. Then his gaze shifted to Nina once more. And you little hawk, if you ever tire of working for Dominic, my door is open. Nina didn't respond, but Dominic spoke for her. She's not switching sides. We'll see, Salvatore murmured. Rain rattled against the warehouse roof. Outside, thunder cracked, rolling across the sky like a warning of the storm yet to come. Dominic turned to Nina as Salvatore's men began preparing for departure. You handled yourself well, he said. Better than most Maid men would have. Nina crossed her arms, half to keep warm, half to hold herself together. I didn't do it for glory. I did it because Mark would have killed me for seeing him enter the estate. And you could run, Dominic said, but you chose to stay. She shook her head. Running doesn't save anyone. And it wouldn't have stopped Mark. Dominic studied her face, the unwavering resolve, the fire beneath the fear. She wasn't simply surviving anymore, she was shaping the battlefield. A maid had become a strategist. And Mark Russo had no idea what storm was coming for him. Salvatore's engines roared to life outside the warehouse, headlights cutting through the rain, swept dark. Dominic looked once more toward the door. Tomorrow, he said, we take back everything they stole. Nina breathed out, steadying herself. Tomorrow, she repeated, we end this. As they stepped out into the storm, Dominic finally felt the tide turning, not because he had an army, not because he had survived, but because the one person Mark had overlooked had become the deadliest weapon in the room. And Nina Hawthorne wasn't done yet. By the next evening, the Caruso estate looked nothing like the battlefield Dominic had escaped. Under the direction of Vanessa and Mark, the mansion had been dressed in heavy black drapes, silver candelabras, and fresh arrangements of white roses, her favorite, not his. Reporters buzzed like flies around the front gates, their lenses pointed toward the grand entrance, eager to feed on tragedy. Politicians in tailored suits, judges in expensive overcoats, and businessmen with polished shoes stepped out of town cars and limousines, all of them offering the same rehearsed condolences for a man they believed was lying somewhere at the bottom of the ocean. Inside, a string quartet played mournful music that echoed through the massive foyer. Guests whispered to each other, pretending to feel grief while calculating what Dominic's death meant for the balance of power in New York. Vanessa Caruso stood at the top of the grand staircase in a black velvet gown and a matching veil, one hand resting dramatically on the banister. Her eyes were red, but not from tears she'd applied, just enough makeup to look heartbreakingly composed. She scanned the room for Mark, who appeared beside her seconds later. A glass of bourbon in hand and a confident smile hidden beneath a mask of concern. Everything's perfect, Mark murmured. By Monday, you'll have the estate. By the end of the month, the entire city will be under our control. Vanessa pressed a hand to her chest as if touched by the reassurance. I just want tonight to go smoothly, no surprises. There won't be. Mark's arrogance was so thick it practically fogged the air around him. He believed he had won. He believed the man he betrayed was gone forever. He believed his future was already written, and that belief was about to destroy him. Downstairs, unnoticed among the movement of catering staff, Nina slipped silently through the service corridors in her restored uniform. She blended in as naturally as if she had never left. Trays of champagne flutes glided past her as she moved deeper into the mansion, toward the security room near the library. Salvatore's men had already infiltrated the perimeter disguised as private security imps and even photographers. They moved with careful precision, each one following the timeline Dominic had laid out during their late night strategy session at the Marcelli docks. Nina's job was simple but crucial: take control of the estate's system. She reached the security door, glanced around to ensure no one was watching, and entered the 4-digit code she had memorized from weeks of cleaning the head of security's office. The keypad blinked green. She slipped inside and locked the door behind her. The monitors flickered with feed from every camera, the crowded foyer, the ballroom full of floral arrangements, the dim hallway leading to Dominic's study, the terrace soaked from last night's storm. Nina moved quickly to the main console, Her fingers trembled not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. She navigated the system with surprising ease, accessing menace she technically had no right to know existed. Dominic had told her exactly which settings to override. Salvatore's technicians had provided the rest. She typed in the final command, hovered her finger over the button, then glanced once more at the monitors. On the main stage, Vanessa stepped toward the microphone placed beside a large frame portrait of Dominic that she had chosen, a flattering one from a charity gala. Mark stood behind her, hand on her shoulder, playing the grieving confidant. Nina exhaled once and pressed execute. Instantly, every light in the mansion died. The quartet stopped mid-note. The room plunged into black as startled gasps rippled through the hall. Mark cursed loudly, pulling out his phone. Backup generators should be kicked in, but they didn't. Nina had disabled them. People panicked, calling for lights, for order, for security, and then a single spotlight snapped on. Not from the estate's system, but from a portable rig smuggled in by Marcelli's men. Wired to an independent battery and aimed exactly where Dominic wanted it. The beam cut through the darkness like a blade and locked onto the top of the grand staircase. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Standing beneath the spotlight, looking as though he had risen from the dead, was Dominic Caruso. His clothes were still torn, mud stained his cuffs and collar, bruises marked his jaw, a bandage wrapped around his forearm. He looked nothing like a man lost at sea. He looked like a man who had crawled back through hell to reclaim his throne. For a moment, no one in the room breathed. Vanessa's mouth fell open, her entire body going rigid. The hand holding her lace handkerchief trembled violently. Mark's bourbon glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Dominic raised a microphone, a simple handheld device connected to the same rig powering the spotlight. His voice echoed through the dead, still mansion. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "I heard there was a funeral." Murmurs erupted. Someone screamed. A politician dropped his champagne flute. Vanessa stumbled backward, gripping the podium for balance. Mark instinctively reached for his gun but stopped the moment a dozen red laser sights danced across his chest. Salvatore's men had taken their positions in the dark. Dominic descended the staircase slowly, each step deliberate, his gaze fixed on the two people who had tried to bury him. "Mark," he said, voice steady, "you told my wife I was sleeping in the Atlantic. You weren't wrong. A part of me did die." He reached the bottom step, standing just feet from Mark and Vanessa. "The part that trusted you." Mark shook his head, trying to recover. "Dominic, wait, we thought your plane save it." Dominic cut in. "I heard everything." Vanessa sobbed, reaching for him. "Dom, please, he forced me, he threatened me enough." Dominic didn't shout, he didn't need to. His calm carried more weight than any roar. The crowd watched, spellbound, terrified. Salvatore stepped from the shadows, leaning on his cane. His presence alone confirmed everything Dominic had said. No one survives a betrayal and walks beside a Marcelli unless truth demands it. Dominic turned to the guests, sweeping the room with his gaze. "This is the woman who stood beside me for years," he said. "The one I trusted with my home, my future, my name." He pointed to Mark. "And this is the man I raised from nothing. Fed him, protected him, treated him as a brother." Dominic paused at the microphone. Both of them decided I wasn't useful anymore. Gasps again. Vanessa cried harder. Mark's jaw clenched in fury and fear. Dominic stepped closer to his former underboss. "You should be made sure I died, Mark." Salvatore spoke from behind Dominic. "He belongs to me now." Mark's eyes widened as two Marcelli enforcers grabbed him by the arms. "Dominic!" "Dom, don't let him take me. You need my connections. You took everything from me," Dominic said. "Now I return the favor." They dragged Mark through the side doors, his shouts echoing down the hall until the storm swallowed them whole. Dominic turned back to Vanessa. The betrayal in her eyes was mixed with desperation. "Dominic," she whispered, "please, I can fix this." "You already did," he replied. "You fixed my blindness." He nodded to his new security chief. "Escort Mrs. Caruso off the property. She leaves with nothing." Vanessa screamed as they pulled her toward the exit. "You can't do this." "I'm your wife." Dominic didn't move, didn't blink, didn't watch her go. The guests began to file out quickly, trying to disappear from the fallout of the revelation they had just witnessed. As the mansion emptied, Dominic stood alone at the center of the foyer, no longer hunted, no longer deceived. He had returned from the dead, and tonight everyone learned the truth. Kings don't fall, they rise. 6 months passed, and New York reshaped itself around the man who refused to stay dead. Dominic Caruso reclaimed his empire piece by piece with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a man who had already tasted the grave. Whispers of his resurrection spread through the criminal underworld, carried by bartenders, union bosses, smugglers, and crooked city officials who suddenly remembered how to say his name with proper respect. The Marcelli alliance held long enough for Dominic to reinstall his own people in key positions. Once Mark Russo's supporters were flushed out, the temporary partnership dissolved exactly as planned, each family retreating to its rightful territory. Weary but satisfied, the balance of power returned to normal except for one glaring difference: Dominic was no longer alone at the top. Nina Hawthorne had become the unexpected axis around which the new Caruso operation revolved. She still wore simple clothes, jeans, boots, a clean button down, but nothing about her resembled the timid maid who once dusted the chandelier in the west hallway. Now, she walked through Dominic's private office suite with a tablet in one hand, a phone in the other, and 3 conversations happening in her head at once. She coordinated shipments, filtered calls from federal contacts Dominic trusted, oversaw renovations, and even handled internal disputes with a calm, cutting logic that impressed the oldest made men in the syndicate. They didn't always like her, but they couldn't deny her. Dominic had elevated her publicly, naming her Executive Director of Operations, a title broad enough to grant her authority in nearly every department and vague enough to confuse anyone who dared challenge her position. Some whispered she controlled more of the empire than Dominic himself. Others believed she was simply his newest obsession. They were wrong on both counts. Dominic didn't obsess, he calculated, and Nina wasn't a lover. She was something far more dangerous, a person he trusted. One evening, as the city lights blurred against the windows of Dominic's high-rise headquarters in Lower Manhattan, Nina entered his office carrying a slim folder. Dominic sat at his desk, reviewing a contract from a construction firm that owed him favors dating back 20 years. He glanced up when she stepped inside. "You relate," he said. "Traffic," she replied, dropping the folder onto his desk. "And your new accountant talks too much." Dominic smirked. "Fire him if you don't like him." "I already did," she said. "I hired someone competent." He paused, then leaned back in his chair. "Good." She took that seat across from him, his right-hand seat, the one formerly reserved for Mark Russo. Dominic studied her for a moment. Nina had a way of sitting with perfect posture, not stiff, not frightened, but prepared. She wore determination the way other women wore jewelry. It fit her. "What's in the folder?" he asked. Nina slid it toward him. "The report on the restructuring for the waterfront contracts. And the last piece of information you asked me to dig up on Vanessa's offshore account." Dominic opened the folder. Inside was a printed spreadsheet listing a series of transactions, dates, and digital trails that Nina had mapped with unflinching precision. "She funneled money through a Belize holding company," Nina said, "tried to hide it under a non-profit front. I had Rocco pull every trace." Dominic closed the folder slowly. "Good work. You want the funds returned?" she asked. Dominic thought for a long moment. "No. Leave them frozen. Consider it tuition." Nina allowed herself a small smile. She stood to leave, but Dominic's voice stopped her. "Sit." She did. He watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. "6 months ago you were sweeping floors," he said. "Now you're recontrolling half my operation." Nina's fingers threaded together in her lap, but she didn't avert her gaze. "6 months ago I wasn't given a choice," she said. "You weren't either." Dominic nodded. "Fair point. Do you regret any of it?" he asked. She thought about it longer than he expected. "I regret what Mark planned," she said softly. "I regret how easily it could be worked. I regret that I had to lie to someone like Salvatore just to keep us alive. But I don't regret staying." Dominic's brows lifted slightly. She didn't correct herself. "You could be run," Dominic said. "You didn't. Running doesn't fix anything," Nina answered. "And I wasn't going to hide while someone else rewrote your legacy." Her voice was steady, unapologetic, powerful. Dominic leaned forward. "You've changed, so have you," she replied, "for the better." "Depends who you ask." He chuckled at that. The room grew quieter, not tense, but grounded, comfortable in a way dangerous men rarely allowed themselves to feel. Dominic broke the moment. "You know the men are still wondering what to call you," he said. "Director." "Lady Caruso." Nina rolled her eyes. "They can call me Nina." "They won't," Dominic said. "You've earned more than a first name." She tilted her head. "What do you call me?" Dominic didn't hesitate. "My right hand." Nina froze, not out of fear, but from the weight of what that title meant. In their world, the right hand wasn't a role. It was a vow, a position higher than blood, a place of trust greater than marriage. The person who touched the empire before anyone else did. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. Dominic stood from his chair, walking toward the window. The city glowed beneath him, yellow lights flickering over skyscrapers, bridges reflecting on the dark river, a humming metropolis that thrived on the choices of men like him. "I'm sure," he said. "Mark betrayed me because he wanted my throne. You saved me because you wanted the truth." He turned back to her. "I trust truth more than blood." Nina didn't smile, but her entire posture softened, and something fierce settled behind her eyes. She wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't frightened. She accepted the weight with the grace of someone born for it. Dominic took a velvet box from the drawer behind him and placed it on the desk. She stared at it, hesitant. "What's that?" "Recognition," he said. "Open it." She did. Inside lay the diamond bracelet Dominic once bought for Vanessa years ago, repurposed, redesigned, now set in a stronger silver band with a sleek, modern cut. Something powerful, something unmistakably hers. Nina looked up at him. "I can't wear this." "You already do," Dominic said. "It fits you more than it ever fit her." She closed the box gently, her fingers lingering on the velvet. Something unspoken crossed between them, not romantic, not possessive, but bonded. Two people forged in survival, sharpened by betrayal, and aligned through necessity and choice. The storm that once chased them through a forest was long gone, but its aftermath had shaped them permanently. Dominic returned to his chair. "Tomorrow we meet with the unions," he said, "then the port authorities, then the mayor's liaison." Nina nodded. "I'll make the schedule." "You always do." She stood gathering her notes in the closed velvet box. Before she left, Dominic added. She paused in the doorway. "Yes, you've earned your position," Dominic said. "Don't ever let anyone question why you're here." Nina met his gaze with quiet fire. "I won't, and if they try, I'll remind them." As she exited the office, the city stretched beneath them like a kingdom reborn. Dominic watched her go, realizing with absolute certainty that the greatest shift in his empire wasn't Mark's fall or Vanessa's exile. It was Nina Hawthorne stepping into a destiny no one could have predicted. Not even him. A new era had begun, and this time Dominic Caruso wasn't ruling alone. In a world built on power, loyalty, and fear, the greatest lesson often arrives not through victory but through betrayal. Dominic Caruso learned this truth in the harshest way possible, not from enemies who had always wanted him dead, but from the two people who stood closest to him. His near murder revealed a foundational principle of human nature that many refuse to confront. Loyalty is not measured by how long someone stands beside you, but by whether they remain when standing beside you becomes dangerous. Mark and Vanessa stayed as long as Dominic's power served their ambitions, and when his presence threatened their self-interest, they chose to erase him from their future. Their betrayal wasn't only an act of violence, it was a reminder that trust given blindly can become the very weapon that destroys a man. True loyalty is not loud, it doesn't flatter, doesn't cling, doesn't perform. It reveals itself only when the stakes turn lethal, when standing with someone costs more than walking away. Nina embodied this truth. A maid with no authority and no reason to risk her life stepped into danger because she recognized moral debt where others saw opportunity. Her courage teaches that sometimes the strongest allies come from the edges of our lives, the people we overlook. The ones with no power accept the integrity they refuse to abandon. Another lesson carved itself into the shape of Dominic's transformation. Power that survives a fall becomes stronger, quieter, and more disciplined than the power that has never been challenged. Dominic had ruled his world with force and calculation, but it was only after losing everything, his home, his allies, his reputation, that he understood what true leadership required. Survival reshaped him. It stripped him of illusions, burned away Navette, and revealed the fragile difference between authority built on fear and authority built on earned loyalty. When he rose again, he was no longer a king sitting comfortably on a throne. He was a man who understood the cost of that throne more intimately than ever. The empire he rebuilt was not the same one he had before. It was stronger, sharper, and anchored by people who had proven themselves through chaos, not convenience. But the story also teaches something darker and equally true. Betrayal often exposes the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. Dominic had ignored warning signs for years. He had mistaken proximity for devotion. He had allowed vanity, comfort, and routine to blind him to the ambitions growing in his own home. Vanessa's greed didn't emerge overnight. Mark's hunger for power didn't materialize in a single plan. Their rebellion grew slowly, like rot beneath polished floorboards. Dominic's downfall began the moment he stopped questioning the motivations of those he trusted most. There is a cost to power, and one of those costs is vigilance, constant, exhausting, unending vigilance. Leaders who forget that eventually pay in blood. Dominic paid with a night of hell, but he emerged with a clarity that many never achieve. Nina's rise within the empire offers a lesson of its own, one that speaks to resilience, adaptation, and identity. She didn't choose the world she stepped into. She didn't seek power, influence, or recognition. But circumstances forced her to become someone entirely new, and instead of breaking, she evolved. Her journey shows that strength is often born from survival, not ambition. People do not always know what they are capable of until the moment they are cornered, hunted, or underestimated. Nina discovered that her mind, not her fear, defined her. Her intelligence became a weapon, her instincts became armor, and her loyalty became the currency that earned her a place beside one of the most powerful men in New York. The lesson here is that greatness does not always roar into existence. Sometimes it steps quietly out of the shadows when the world least expects it. Yet perhaps the deepest lesson of the story is this: rebirth is possible, but only when a person is willing to shed who they were before. Dominic rising again after his own funeral is proof that a man can reinvent himself even after losing everything, but reinvention demands sacrifice. He had to let go of old alliances, old comforts, and old versions of himself. He had to accept that the world he ruled had changed and that he needed to change with it. He didn't reclaim his throne by returning as the man he once was. He reclaimed it by becoming someone new, someone shaped by fire, betrayal, and the rare loyalty of an unexpected ally. Nina's transformation mirrors this truth. She abandoned her old life not by choice, but by necessity. And in its absence, she built a version of herself stronger than the world that tried to destroy her. In the end, the story reminds us that the people we trust define our fate. Power does not protect a man from betrayal. Wealth does not shield him from loss. Influence does not guarantee loyalty. The only true safety lies in understanding the hearts of those we allow close. Dominic learned that a lifetime of alliances meant nothing if he could not recognize the intentions of the people sharing his roof. But he also learned that loyalty can come from the most unexpected places, and that the right partner, even one who enters our lives by accident, can alter the direction of an entire empire. The final lesson is both hopeful and brutal. Survival is not about strength alone. It is about adaptability, clarity, and the courage to trust again after everything has collapsed. Dominic trusted Nina not blindly, but intentionally, after witnessing her bravery, her intelligence, and her unwavering commitment to truth. She trusted him not because he was powerful, but because he refused to abandon integrity even in the darkest moments. Together they rebuilt something stronger than dominance. They built purpose. And that is the heart of the story. Not the violence. Not the betrayal. Not the power reclaimed. But the transformation of two people who refused to die, one in body, the other in spirit, and discovered that sometimes the most extraordinary alliances are born not from loyalty owed, but from loyalty earned.
If you find this video helpful, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss upcoming videos. If you have any suggestions or questions, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd really love to hear your feedback. Thank you for watching until the end.